The night had a particular kind of silence on the frontier, not the peaceful kind you find in a quiet bedroom with clean sheets and a locked door. This was the silence of open land, of darkness, stretching so far in every direction that a man could feel genuinely swallowed by it. Out on the trail, in the broken hills and alkali flats of the American West, sleep was not a comfort. It was a gamble. Every cowboy who closed his eyes in outlaw territory was betting that when the sun came back up, he would still be breathing. Most of them were right, but the ones who were wrong became the stories that kept everyone else awake at night. To understand how cowboys slept, you have to first understand what they were sleeping in the middle of. The American frontier from roughly the 1860s through the turn of the 20th century was one of the most lawless stretches of inhabited land the modern world had ever produced. Federal authority was thin, local law enforcement was either corrupt, underfunded, or simply absent, and the distances between towns made justice a slow and uncertain thing. Outlaws moved freely through this landscape because the landscape itself provided them cover. Canyons, river breaks, thick timber, and vast open plains where a man could be spotted from miles away or completely hidden in a ravine. All of this made the frontier simultaneously dangerous and difficult to police. And through all of it, cattle drives moved thousands of animals and dozens of men across hundreds of miles of this exact terrain. A typical cattle drive crew consisted of a trail boss, somewhere between 8 and 15 cowboys, depending on the size of the herd, a cook who drove the chuck wagon, and a wrangler responsible for the remuda, which was the spare horse herd. Each man had a specific job, and that job did not pause for darkness. Cattle do not stop being cattle at sundown. They drift, they spook, they can stampede from a crack of thunder or the smell of a predator. This meant that while a portion of the crew slept, others were always out in the dark, riding slow circles around the herd, singing softly to keep the animals calm. The cowboy who was off duty and trying to sleep was doing so knowing that the man taking his place might come back to wake him for trouble at any moment. The bedroll was the cowboy's entire sleeping world. It was not a simple blanket tossed on the ground. A proper trail bedroll was a carefully assembled piece of survival equipment. The outer shell was typically made of heavy canvas, treated with oil or wax to shed rain and morning dew. Inside, a cowboy would layer his blankets, usually 2 or 3 of them made from thick wool, because wool retains heat even when damp, and the desert nights could drop temperatures dramatically, even after a scorching afternoon. The bedroll, when packed, was tight and compact, tied with leather straps, and lashed to the back of the saddle or stowed in the chuck wagon when the crew was moving. When it was time to sleep, it unrolled to form a full sleeping surface about 7 feet long and wide enough for a grown man to wrap himself completely. There was a practical wisdom to the positioning of the bedroll that went well beyond comfort. Cowboys did not simply drop their gear wherever they stopped. A man who understood the land chose his sleeping position the way a chess player thinks several moves ahead. The base of a rocky outcropping provided a natural windbreak and meant that nothing could approach from one direction without making noise on the stone. A shallow depression in the earth kept a man below the sight line of anyone scanning the camp from a distance. Sleeping too close to the fire was considered reckless by experienced hands. The firelight destroyed your night vision, made you a visible target, and the heat made you sleep too heavily. A smart cowboy bedded down far enough from the fire to sit in darkness, but close enough to benefit from its warmth. The boots stayed on. This is one of those details that sounds like romanticized folklore until you understand the reasoning behind it. A man who fell asleep with his boots off in dangerous territory was a man who could not run if something went wrong. Getting boots on in a hurry, in the dark, on rough ground, while something threatening was already happening, was a liability no experienced cowboy was willing to carry. Boots stayed on, unless a man was sleeping inside solid walls with a locked door, and even then, some of the more cautious veterans kept them within arm's reach. The spurs were usually removed. They were noisy and could tangle in the bedroll. But the boots themselves were non-negotiable. The sidearm was the other constant. Wherever the gun was during the day, it was close to the hand during the night. Most cowboys slept with the revolver tucked under the edge of the saddle they were using as a pillow, or coiled inside the bedroll itself near the hip. The position mattered. A weapon buried under layers of canvas and blanket was no weapon at all when a man came out of sleep in a sudden alarm. The gun needed to be accessible in the first second of waking, not the fifth. This was a habit drilled into trail hands by older, more experienced men, and any cowboy who wanted to survive long enough to spend his wages took the lesson seriously. Drop what you're doing for a second. Where are you watching from right now? Leave a comment with your city or state. We want to know where our audience is coming from. People are watching this from all over the country, and it is genuinely one of our favorite things to see. Write it in the comments right now. The chuck wagon established the organizational center of the night camp, but that center was not necessarily the safest place to sleep. The cook, who was often one of the most respected and sometimes the most feared figures in any trail crew, typically slept under or near his wagon. The wagon itself provided partial shelter, and the supplies inside it, flour, dried beans, bacon, coffee, tools, were valuable enough that having a trusted man close to them made sense. The tongue of the chuck wagon was traditionally pointed toward the North Star when camp was made, serving as a simple navigational aid for the night riders and anyone who needed to orient themselves in the dark. This was not superstition, but practical compass work, a way of keeping the entire camp oriented without additional tools. Night guard was divided into watches, typically 2-hour shifts rotated through the crew. The mathematics of this arrangement were brutal in a straightforward way. If you had 10 cowboys and needed 2 men on watch at all times, the night's sleep was interrupted regardless of when your shift fell. A man coming off the midnight watch did not simply fall back into deep sleep. His body was alert. His senses had been sharpened by 2 hours in the dark listening for trouble, and the transition back to unconsciousness took time. By the time a trail drive reached its destination after weeks on the move, the cumulative sleep deprivation had turned grown men into hollow-eyed, short-tempered shells of themselves. Trail bosses knew this and managed it carefully, because exhausted cowboys made poor decisions, and poor decisions on a cattle drive could be fatal. The sounds of night camp were their own education. A cowboy who had spent enough seasons on the trail developed an unconscious map of what the darkness was supposed to sound like. Cattle settling and shifting weight had a particular sound. Horses moving in the remuda had another. Coyotes calling at a distance were different from coyotes suddenly going silent, which itself meant something. The wind through dry grass was distinct from the sound of a man moving through dry grass. Men who had been on the trail long enough processed all of this information in their sleep, rising to full alertness, not at loud noises, but at the absence of expected sounds, or the presence of sounds that did not belong. This instinct, refined over years, was the difference between a cowboy who lasted and one who did not. Rain presented a different kind of misery. The oilcloth outer shell of the bedroll was designed to shed water, but a sustained downpour in open country eventually found its way through every seam and fold. Cowboys sleeping in the rain were sleeping in a slow process of becoming wet, and wet wool blankets weighed what felt like twice their dry weight and lost their insulating properties with every additional degree of saturation. The experienced hand slept with his hat on, even in the rain, positioned over his face so the brim directed water away from his airways. A tarpaulin rigged from the chuck wagon or between available trees could provide modest overhead cover, but in truly open prairie country, there was nothing between a man and the sky, and he simply endured it. Lightning was the nightmare of the open range. During a thunderstorm, cattle were at their most unpredictable, and a stampede could be triggered by a single close strike. Cowboys on night watch during electrical storms were threading a needle. They needed to stay close enough to the herd to respond to movement, but not so close that they were caught under the hooves if the animals bolted. Sleeping cowboys were warned that during a storm they needed to be ready to move the instant they heard the thunder change character or felt the ground vibration that preceded a running herd. Men had been killed in their bedrolls by stampeding cattle, and every cowboy on every drive knew it. The actual outlaws who gave certain territories their reputations were a more complicated reality than the stories suggest. The frontier in the peak years of the cattle drives was populated by men who had come west for various reasons, some of them entirely legitimate, and some of them specifically because they were fleeing something: debt, warrants, failed lives, or the aftermath of the Civil War, which had left hundreds of thousands of men dislocated, trauma-hardened, and skilled with weapons. These men occupied the same trail corridors that the cattle drives used, because those corridors followed water and grass, which were the same resources that any human being needed to survive in that landscape. Hold on. Seriously, if you are enjoying this video, take 3 seconds and leave a comment telling us what you think. Do you want more content about the real lives of cowboys? What part of the frontier era fascinates you most? The comment section is how we know what to make next, and every single comment genuinely matters to us. Go ahead, we will wait. Rustling was the economic crime that trail bosses feared most, and it happened at night with deliberate coordination. Professional cattle thieves did not work alone. They operated in groups, with some members positioned near the sleeping camp as observation, while others moved through the outer edge of the herd, cutting off small groups of animals. The night riders were the primary defense against this, but 2 men circling a herd of 2,000 cattle in darkness across a perimeter of several miles had obvious limitations. Rustlers understood cattle behavior as well as any cowboy, and could work quietly enough to peel off 50 head without triggering a stampede, moving the stolen animals away in the darkness before the morning count revealed the loss. The response to rustling when it was caught in the act was frequently violent and immediate. The frontier legal system was too slow, too distant, and too unreliable to be the first resort in a situation where a man had just fired at your camp or was driving your herd into the darkness. Trail bosses carried authority to use force in protection of the drive, and that authority was understood by every man in the crew. The stories of rustlers being shot during raids were not exceptional news on the frontier. They were simply how the night watch worked when something went wrong. Sleeping in actual outlaw territory, meaning regions specifically known to be occupied by organized gangs operating out of fixed locations, required an entirely different calculus. The Indian Territory that would eventually become Oklahoma was perhaps the most famous of these regions in the latter decades of the 19th century. The 5 civilized tribes had been relocated there, and the U.S. government's complicated relationship with tribal sovereignty meant that federal law enforcement had limited jurisdiction, which outlaws exploited systematically. Bass Reeves, the legendary deputy marshal who worked that territory for decades, operated across a landscape where entire communities were at minimum complicit in shielding fugitives and at maximum actively organized around criminal enterprise. Cowboys moving cattle through or near such territories were advised to alter their camp routines in ways that an outsider might not immediately understand. The fire was made small and early, burned down to coals before full dark so that its light signature was minimal. Camps were positioned off the obvious trail, requiring any observer to have specific knowledge of where to look. The cook made supper before dark, so that the smell of cooking food did not announce the camp's position for an extended period. Night riders were instructed to change their circuit patterns irregularly, because a predictable route was a predictable vulnerability. None of this was paranoia. It was procedure developed from actual experience with what happened to camps that skipped the precautions. The relationship between cowboys and the indigenous populations of the territories they crossed was layered with complexity that the popular image of the frontier entirely erases. Many of the most experienced trail hands had years of direct experience working alongside, trading with, and sometimes fighting against various nations. and that experience had produced a nuanced, practical knowledge that bore no resemblance to the simplified narratives that reached Eastern newspapers. A camp positioned in territory traditionally used by a specific nation knew that the Night Watch had to account for that possibility in a way that was distinct from the danger of Anglo outlaw gangs. The response protocols were different, the warning signs were different, and the outcome of a misreading could be identical. Horses were the early warning system that technology had not yet replaced. Horses are prey animals with sensory capabilities far exceeding a human being's in darkness. Their hearing detects frequencies and at distances that no man can match, and their sense of smell operates at a range that makes them effective scouts simply by existing. A remuda of horses that suddenly shifted position, raised their heads, or began moving in tight nervous circles was communicating something to anyone who knew how to read it. Cowboys who understood horses, and all of them understood horses, because the working relationship was the foundation of everything they did, could read a change in the remuda's behavior as a reliable signal that something was wrong outside the camp. This was not superstition, but a functional sensor network composed of living animals. The trail boss typically did not sleep at the center of camp with the regular hands. He positioned himself slightly apart, usually with a clear view of the remuda and the approaches to camp, and with enough distance from the main bedroll area that a rush into camp would pass the regular hands before reaching him. This was partly tactical. A leader who went down first left the crew without coordination at the worst possible moment, and partly a function of the trail boss's specific responsibilities. He was the one who needed to assess the situation before anyone else acted, and he could not do that from inside the middle of a confused, dark scramble. We are deep into the real world of the frontier now, and we want to know, are you learning something you did not know before? Did any of this surprise you? Hit the like button if you are getting value from this video, and leave us a comment with the most surprising thing you have heard so far. Your engagement is what keeps this channel going, and we read every comment that comes in. The chuckwagon cook operated on a schedule that required him to be functional before anyone else in camp, and functional again after everyone else had gone to sleep. He was typically the last man to bed down, and the first man up, sometimes by 2 hours. The fire had to be going, the coffee had to be hot, and breakfast had to be ready before the crew began stirring, because a cold camp and no coffee before a day's work was the kind of thing that broke morale in measurable ways. Cooks who could not maintain this rhythm did not last long on the trail, and cooks who could were paid more than ordinary cowboys and treated with a degree of respect that their formal position in the hierarchy did not fully explain. Water shaped everything about where a camp was made, and water sources created their own dangers. A river crossing, a reliable spring, a rock tank that collected rainwater. These were known features of the landscape that everyone who used the trail knew about. This made them natural gathering points, which meant that any night camp made near water was a night camp made near a location that other people knew and might approach. Outlaws who wanted to intercept a trail drive had a practical starting point in simply knowing where the water was and positioning themselves accordingly. Trail bosses who understood this chose water access carefully, sometimes pushing the herd past the obvious spot to water at a less-known location or approaching a known source at an unexpected hour. Rattlesnakes were a genuine nocturnal hazard that operated entirely independently of human threat. The desert southwest and much of the southern trail country were dense with rattlesnake populations, and snakes moved actively at night, seeking warmth and prey. A bedroll on the ground was an attractive, warm object from a snake's perspective, and enough cowboys had been bitten in their sleep or reaching into their gear in the dark that the precautions around this were taken as seriously as the precautions around human threats. Shaking out every piece of gear before use, never reaching into a dark space without first ensuring it was clear, and checking the immediate area around the bedroll before lying down. These were habits instilled early and maintained constantly. A rattlesnake bite in the middle of outlaw territory, 2 weeks from the nearest doctor, was a slow and painful way to die. The social structure of the night camp was rigidly informal, which is to say, there were unwritten rules that everyone understood and enforced, without anyone having to state them explicitly. A man who woke another man unnecessarily was looked upon very poorly, because sleep was a scarce resource, and wasting another man's portion of it was a genuine transgression. A man who failed to perform his night watch completely, who cut his circuit short, who sat still too long, who dozed in the saddle, was putting every sleeping man in the camp at elevated risk, and this was understood with the weight of something much more serious than a policy violation. Trail drives were small communities in which every individual's performance had direct consequences for everyone else's survival, and the social pressure this created was constant and total. Gambling was part of life in camp, but it was managed carefully around the night watch schedule. A cowboy who lost his sleep to a card game and then went on watch in an impaired state was a known problem type, and experienced trail bosses established informal rules around this that were enforced through peer pressure, if not explicit prohibition. The frontier was not a temperance society, and whiskey traveled on many drives, despite the trail boss's preferences. But a man who showed up to stand watch drunk was a man who would answer for it in ways that did not require a formal process. The folklore of the frontier has given us an image of the cowboy as a romantic figure, solitary, stoic, defined by landscape and hardship in ways that translate into a certain kind of nobility. The reality was considerably less romantic and considerably more interesting. The men who drove cattle across the American West from Texas to Kansas, from Arizona to Montana, were working-class laborers performing exhausting and dangerous physical work for wages that were low by any contemporary standard. Their skill was genuine and their courage was real. But it was the courage of men who did a difficult job because it was the job available, not because they had chosen hardship as a form of self-expression. The diversity of the actual historical cattle drive workforce has been systematically erased from the popular image. Historians estimate that between a quarter and a third of all trail hands in the peak cattle drive era were black men, many of them former enslaved people who had developed exceptional horsemanship and cattle skills in the antebellum South and brought those skills into the post-war economy. Mexican vaqueros had been working cattle in the Southwest for generations before the Anglo cattle drive industry developed, and their techniques, equipment, and vocabulary formed the literal foundation of cowboy culture. The word lasso comes from the Spanish lazo, the word ranch from rancho, the technique of roping from practices developed in northern Mexico centuries before Texas existed as a concept. These men slept in the same outlaw territory, faced the same dangers, and are largely absent from the stories that got told afterward. This is actually a perfect moment to ask you something. If you could go back and spend 1 week living the life of a real frontier cowboy, would you do it? Leave your answer in the comments, yes or no, and tell us why. We are genuinely curious how many people romanticize this life versus how many look at what we have been describing and think, absolutely not. Both answers are completely valid. Drop it below. The end of the trail drive did not mean the end of the danger. Towns like Abilene and Dodge City and Cheyenne, which served as the terminus points for major cattle drives, were themselves deeply volatile environments. Cowboys, arriving at the end of weeks on the trail with wages in their pockets and no further obligations, were entering spaces where every form of vice and predation had established itself specifically to extract those wages as efficiently as possible. Saloons, gambling houses, and the people who operated within them were professionals at what they did, and the cowboys who walked in were frequently at a significant disadvantage in terms of experience and sobriety. The violence that erupted in these towns was real, well documented, and partly a function of the same suppressed tension that the trail had accumulated over hundreds of miles. Sleeping in town after weeks on the trail had its own complications. A bed in a boarding house or hotel was a luxury that cost money, and a cowboy who had just spent his trail wages on whiskey and cards might find himself back in his bedroll in the livery stable or behind a building, which was only marginally safer than the open range. The social geography of the cattle town was precisely mapped along lines of economic status and race, with different establishments serving different populations and the threat of violence running along every boundary. A black cowboy, arriving in Dodge City in 1875, was operating in a social environment that was hostile to him, in ways entirely distinct from the hostility of the trail. And the documented record of this period makes the sanitized mythology look like a different country. Winter trail driving existed and was substantially more brutal than the period's popular image captures. Most of the famous drives occurred in the spring and summer, but cattle were moved year-round when the economic need demanded it, and a cowboy caught in a blizzard on the open plains was facing conditions that killed with reliable efficiency. The body loses heat in cold and wet conditions at a rate that can become fatal within hours, and a wet bedroll in below freezing temperatures was not a sleeping surface, but a death trap. Cowboys caught in winter storms, dug into the lee side of hills, huddled together for body heat, kept moving to maintain circulation, and made decisions about where to shelter that required genuine skill and knowledge of the landscape. Men who made the wrong decision did not survive to describe it. The sleep of a cowboy in outlaw territory was never only sleep. It was managed vulnerability. Every bedroll position, every placed gun, every low song in the dark, a calculated answer to what that darkness held.